The Smoky Mountains stretched endlessly, their misty peaks shrouded in a thick blanket of evergreens. Nestled deep in this vast wilderness was a secluded one-bedroom cabin advertised as the perfect romantic escape. For Ellie and Mark, together for 4 years, it seemed like the ideal weekend getaway. A chance to leave behind the city's chaos and rediscover themselves in nature's silence. When they arrived, the cabin looked exactly as promised, rustic yet charming, with a wraparound porch, a stone fireplace, and a creek that gurgled softly nearby. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away. As the sun sank below the towering pines, drenching the forest in shadow, Ellie teased, "Feels like we're the last people on Earth." Mark chuckled, but her words hung in the air, heavy as the darkness that followed. The first night passed uneventfully, save for the sounds of the woods, owls calling, leaves whispering in the breeze, and the occasional snap of a twig. But the next morning, Ellie noticed something strange. The loaf of bread they'd left on the counter was gone. "Did you have a midnight snack?" she asked Mark. "Maybe you forgot to pack it," he replied with a shrug and a smirk. Ellie let it go, though unease prickled at the back of her mind. By the second night, odd occurrences began to pile up. A faint, sour smell lingered in the cabin, stronger than before. The front door, which they'd locked before bed, was wide open when they woke up. Mark brushed it off. "It's an old cabin. Doors can warp, wind can push them open. Don't stress about it." But Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That afternoon, while Mark chopped wood outside, Ellie spotted something that made her blood run cold. Large footprints pressed into the dirt below the kitchen window. They were too big to belong to Mark, and they weren't hers. She didn't tell him, not immediately, but that night Ellie couldn't sleep. As Mark snored softly beside her, she stared at the ceiling, straining to hear any sound beyond the hum of the forest. At 3:12 a.m., she heard it, a faint creak of the floorboards. Her breath caught. She lay perfectly still, her eyes darting to the bedroom door, which they'd left ajar. In the darkness, she thought she saw movement, a shadow slipping soundlessly past the doorway. Her heart hammered as she shook Mark awake. Groggy and irritated, he reached for his phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the living room's mismatched furniture. "You're imagining things," Mark muttered, pulling the blanket back over his head. But Ellie stayed awake, her ears attuned to every sound. At dawn, she insisted they search the cabin. While Mark checked the exterior, Ellie returned to the pantry. She noticed something she'd missed before, a loose wooden plank on the floor. "Mark, come here," she called, her voice shaking. Mark joined her, and together they lifted the plank. Beneath it was a small crawl space, barely large enough to move through. He shone his flashlight inside, and the sight made his face go pale. It was a makeshift hideout. A ratty blanket was spread out like a bed, surrounded by empty food cans, a few crumpled clothes, and an old notebook. Ellie picked up the notebook and flipped through its pages. Her stomach turned. The drawings were crude but recognizable. The cabin's layout, detailed observations of their movements, and a single sentence scrawled repeatedly. "They don't know I'm here." Before they could process what they were seeing, a loud crack echoed from outside, a branch snapping underfoot. "Get your stuff, now!" Mark hissed, grabbing Ellie's arm. They bolted to their car, leaving behind their bags, their food, and the terrifying notebook. Mark floored the gas pedal, the tires skidding on the dirt road. Ellie couldn't resist glancing back as they sped away. For a moment, she froze. Standing on the porch was a figure a tall, unmoving silhouette that seemed to watch them vanish into the woods. When they reported the incident to the rental agency, they were met with indifference. "That's unusual," the agent said with a forced chuckle. "We'll check into it." Ellie wasn't reassured. Days later, curiosity got the better of her. She checked the listing online. The cabin was still there, still advertised as the perfect romantic escape. Even worse, it was fully booked for the following weekend. Ellie knew the truth. Someone was still there, hiding in the walls or beneath the floors, watching, waiting. And whoever it was, they had no intention of leaving. The cabin sat hunched under the shadow of the Pacific Northwest's towering pines, its sagging roof barely holding back the storm above. It had been a last-minute find by 4 college friends whose plans for a camping trip had been washed away by relentless rain. Inside, the cabin was as uninviting as its exterior, its damp, mildewed walls barely holding together a single room filled with mismatched furniture. An armchair with stuffing spilling out, a rusty bed frame, and a rickety table missing one leg were all that greeted them. It was a far cry from cozy, but it was better than sleeping outside in the mud. Emily, Grace, Rob, and Dylan settled in, trying to ignore the steady drum of rain on the roof. Grace lit the propane stove to reheat canned chili, while Rob and Dylan exchanged exaggerated ghost stories by lantern light. Laughter bounced off the cabin walls, and for a few hours they forgot the storm raging outside. Until 2:33 a.m. Emily was the first to hear it, 3 deliberate knocks on the front window pane. She bolted upright in her sleeping bag, her heart pounding. She glanced at Rob, who was closest to the window. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Hear what?" Rob grumbled, half asleep. Before she could answer, the knocking came again. 3 slow, deliberate taps. Rob sat up this time, grabbing the flashlight from his pack. He shone the beam out the rain-streaked glass, but all it revealed was the distorted reflection of the room behind them. "Nothing's out there," he said, though his voice wavered. Emily lay back down but didn't sleep. The next day passed without incident, though a sense of unease lingered. They avoided mentioning the knocking, convincing themselves it had been a tree branch or the wind. By nightfall, they tried to distract themselves with card games and jokes, but as the lantern dimmed, the tension crept back in. At exactly 2:33 a.m., the knocking returned. This time, it was louder. "Tell me you heard that," Emily said, sitting up. The others were already awake. Rob grabbed the flashlight again, shining it across the window. The rain had let up, but the beam revealed nothing but the dense forest beyond. "Maybe it's just an animal," Dylan offered, though his voice was thin. "Animals don't knock," Emily shot back. As if in response, the sound moved. 3 taps came from the window at the far end of the cabin, then another set from the back wall. "It's circling us," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. Rob, trying to appear brave, grabbed his jacket. "Enough of this. I'm going outside to check." "No," Emily hissed, but Rob was already at the door. The others watched in tense silence as he stepped onto the porch. Rain dripped from the roof, and the air was thick with the earthy scent of wet pine. Rob's flashlight beam danced across the trees, revealing nothing but swaying branches. Then, just as he turned back to the door, Emily's eyes caught something. 2 pale, glowing orbs reflecting in the flashlight's beam, high above the ground, far too high to belong to any animal she could think of. "Rob, get inside," she screamed. He didn't hesitate, slamming the door behind him. The knocking resumed almost immediately, this time faster and more erratic. A scraping sound followed, like fingernails dragging along the wooden walls. Then came the faintest of noises, a distorted, almost human-like laugh. No one slept that night. They huddled together in silence, waiting for dawn. When the sun finally rose, the sound stopped. Exhausted and rattled, the group decided to leave immediately. But as they stepped onto the porch, they froze. Neatly arranged on the ground were small piles of twigs, each shaped like a crude human figure. Some were propped against the walls. Others lay scattered on the porch steps. They fled to the nearest ranger station, babbling their story to an unimpressed officer. "Probably just some pranksters," he said, shrugging. Later, when they returned with the ranger, the cabin was empty. The twig figures were gone, as if they'd never been there. But Emily couldn't forget the glowing eyes, or the way the knocking always came at exactly the same time, 2:33 a.m. Nate had been searching for an affordable getaway, a quiet spot to finish his novel, when he stumbled across an Airbnb listing for a cabin in the Adirondacks. It seemed perfect. The photos showed a quaint, well-kept space with a wood stove, a desk by a large window overlooking the woods, and a cozy queen-sized bed. The price was unusually low, but Nate didn't question it. He needed solitude, and this place promised just that. No Wi-Fi, no neighbors, and endless forest in every direction. When he arrived, the cabin looked even better than the photos. The wood stove was already burning, filling the air with the faint smell of cedar, and a steaming mug of coffee sat waiting on the kitchen counter, a welcoming touch from the host. But something caught his eye almost immediately. At the far end of the cabin was a door painted a deep blood red. Unlike the others, it had no handle, only a small keyhole, and it seemed oddly out of place in the otherwise rustic interior. The door made Nate uneasy, though he couldn't explain why. The way it absorbed the light, the subtle grooves in its surface, it felt wrong. That night, Nate struggled to focus on his writing. He sat at the desk by the window, staring at the blank page on his laptop, but his mind kept drifting back to the door. Around midnight, the cabin grew colder. The fire in the stove burned bright, but the chill seemed to seep from the direction of the red door. He glanced over at it. The air around the frame seemed almost warped, like the heat from the stove didn't quite reach it. He tried to dismiss the thought, chalking it up to his overactive imagination. But when he finally crawled into bed, he swore he heard a faint noise coming from the door. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingertips brushing against wood. The next morning, Nate woke to find scratches on the red door. They hadn't been there the day before, long, jagged lines carved into the paint, as if something had been clawing at it from the inside. His stomach turned as he crouched to examine them. Were they there before? He couldn't be sure. He messaged the cabin's owner through the app. "Hi, just curious. Is the red door supposed to be locked? I heard some strange noises last night." No response came. That afternoon, Nate explored the woods surrounding the cabin. The forest was eerily quiet. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of leaves beneath his boots. As he walked, he noticed something odd. A series of symbols carved into the trunks of nearby trees. Circles, crude human figures, and jagged lines, all eerily similar to the scratches on the red door. The unsettling sight pushed him back to the cabin. That night, the tapping returned, louder this time. It was almost midnight, and Nate sat frozen at the desk, staring at the red door. The scratches had deepened, the grooves now cutting through layers of paint. The tapping stopped, replaced by a faint whisper. It was unintelligible at first, but as Nate strained to listen, he caught a single word. "Open." A shiver ran through him. He grabbed his phone and called the host, but the line went straight to voicemail. His fingers trembled as he dialed again. Still no answer. He tried the front door. It wouldn't budge. The windows, too, were stuck. No matter how hard he pulled, they wouldn't open. Panic clawed at him. He was trapped. At 2 a.m., the whispering grew louder, filling the cabin like a low, guttural chant. The air grew thick and hot, the temperature in the room rising unnaturally. Nate grabbed the fire poker from beside the stove and approached the door. Sweat dripped down his face as he raised the poker. He hesitated, the chanting now accompanied by faint screams that seemed to come from within the walls. Then, with a cry, he swung the poker at the door. It splintered with a deafening crack. Behind it was a small room, its walls painted in the same deep red. Symbols covered every surface, carved into the wood and smeared in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. In the center of the room sat a cassette player, surrounded by the remains of melted candles. Nate, breathing heavily, stepped inside and pressed play. A guttural voice erupted from the speakers, chanting in a language he couldn't understand. Then came the screams, human and animal, overlapping in a crescendo of agony. The room grew unbearably hot, the air thick with the smell of decay and sulfur. The symbols on the walls began to glow, their lines pulsating with an unnatural red light. Suddenly, the cabin shook violently. The fire in the stove flared, its flames licking at the ceiling. Nate stumbled out of the red room, the cassette player's screams following him. He bolted to the front door, and this time it opened. Nate ran through the forest, the glow of the cabin fading behind him. Even as he reached his car, parked a mile down the dirt road, he could still hear the faint chanting, as if it were coming from the trees themselves. Days later, when Nate returned with authorities, the cabin was gone. All that remained was a patch of scorched earth and the faint acrid smell of smoke. The Airbnb listing had vanished, leaving no trace of its existence. In his journal, Nate wrote one last note before abandoning his novel. Some doors aren't meant to be opened.